The black man stood frozen, humiliated in front of the entire plane. "Sir, first class is not for people like you," the flight attendant sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. Muffled laughter, side eyes, passengers watching but saying nothing. The teacher clenched his jaw, swallowing the anger boiling inside him, but he did not argue, not yet. Because by the end of this flight, that same flight attendant would be standing before him, not as a superior, but as a man with everything to lose, begging for mercy, and the world would be watching. Nathaniel Carter adjusted the strap of his leather satchel as he stepped onto the plane, his heart light with anticipation. For years, he had flown economy, content with a quiet seat in the back, where he could pull out a book and disappear into its pages. But today was different. Today, he had booked first class. Not because he needed the luxury, not because he craved attention, but because, for once, he wanted to enjoy the very experience he had worked so hard to create. He moved down the aisle, his eyes scanning the row numbers. The plush, wide seats of first class came into view, each one dressed in pristine white linen, glasses of sparkling water waiting on the armrests. He smiled, glancing down at his boarding pass. Seat 2A. He reached his row and started to place his bag in the overhead compartment. That was when he heard it. A voice, sharp, unmistakably condescending. "Sir, I think you are in the wrong section." Nathaniel turned. The flight attendant, a tall, slim man with slicked-back blonde hair and a crisp navy blue uniform, was standing before him, arms crossed, an eyebrow arched with suspicion. Nathaniel blinked, slightly taken aback. "No, I do not think so. I am in seat 2A. The attendant's eyes flicked over him, lingering on his brown skin, his simple attire, an ironed button-down and slacks, nothing flashy. His lips curled in amusement, as if Nathaniel had made a joke. "Sir," the attendant said again, "first class is reserved for our valued passengers." Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten. A strange silence had fallen over the nearby seats. A woman in pearls peered over her magazine, eyes scanning him from head to toe. A businessman glanced up from his laptop, then quickly looked away. And then, the worst part, a muffled chuckle from someone in row 3. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "Here," he said, handing over his boarding pass. The flight attendant snatched it, barely glancing before shaking his head with an exaggerated sigh. "Mr. Carter," he drawled, as if the name itself was a joke. "You must have made a mistake when booking. This is a premium cabin." Nathaniel could feel the heat rise to his face. No mistake. His voice was steady, but his patience was thinning. The attendant smirked. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Nathaniel could hear. "Listen, sir, we both know how this goes. I can escort you to economy, or security can." Nathaniel stared at him. For a split second, the urge to speak up burned inside him, to remind this man exactly who he was. But then he looked around. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the businessman, the one who had looked uncomfortable, kept his head down, pretending to type. Nathaniel saw the game being played, and he made a decision. Slowly, he nodded. Without another word, he reached for his bag and turned toward economy. But before he sat down, his gaze flickered to the airline's logo embroidered on the headrest of every first-class seat, the airline he owned. He settled into his economy seat, the hum of the engines filling the silence left by his humiliation. But the flight attendant had no idea. Before this flight landed, everything would change. Nathaniel Carter leaned back in his cramped economy seat, taking a slow, measured breath. He could still feel the weight of the stares, the silent judgment, the amusement at his expense. But what none of them knew, what none of them could know, was that this moment had not broken him. He had been here before. The feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, treated as if he did not belong. It was as familiar to him as the air he breathed. But what had they always failed to see? He never stayed at the bottom. Nathaniel glanced out the small, oval-shaped window, watching as the airport runway shrank beneath them. His mind drifted back, tracing the road that had led him here. Nathaniel had never been handed anything in life. Born and raised in the heart of Chicago, he grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, but dreams were abundant. His mother, a schoolteacher, had spent her days pouring knowledge into young minds, while his father worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Education was the one thing they had always told him no one could take away. So he studied, worked, hustled. He became a teacher, just like his mother, determined to change the futures of children who had been told, just as he had, that they would never amount to much. But Nathaniel was not just a teacher. He was a man with vision. Over the years he had saved, invested wisely, and expanded his financial knowledge. What started as modest stock investments turned into something far greater. He took risks, made smart moves, and eventually found himself in a position he never thought possible, owning a controlling stake in an airline. And yet, even after all of that, this moment on the plane had reminded him of a cruel truth. Money did not erase prejudice. Success did not guarantee respect. Even now, as the majority owner of the very airline he was flying on, he was still just another black man to be dismissed, ridiculed, and shuffled to the back. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He had not wanted to make a scene, had not wanted to reveal his power yet, but something told him this flight was not over. And before they landed, the people who had laughed at him would learn a lesson they would never forget. Nathaniel sat stiffly in his economy seat, his fingers pressing into the armrest as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet. The murmurs had died down, but the weight of the humiliation still clung to him. A flight attendant should have moved on, continued serving passengers, forgotten about the man he had dismissed, but this one didn't. From the moment Nathaniel had been forced to move, the flight attendant, his name tag read Logan, made it his mission to remind him of his place. As Logan moved down the aisle, he handed out drinks to passengers with a plastic smile. "Champagne for you, sir." "A glass of white wine, ma'am." "Enjoy your flight." When he reached Nathaniel's row, his entire demeanor shifted. His smile disappeared. His tone turned sharp. Nathaniel watched as Logan poured glasses of water for the passengers on either side of him, skipping over him entirely. "Excuse me," Nathaniel said, keeping his voice even. "Could I get some water?" Logan barely glanced at him. "Oh," he said flatly. "We're all out at the moment." Nathaniel's fingers curled into a fist. Out? The man had just poured 2 fresh glasses right in front of him. But before he could respond, Logan turned on his heel and disappeared into the galley. The woman in the seat next to Nathaniel, a middle-aged woman with graying curls, shifted uncomfortably. She had seen it too. Nathaniel exhaled, willing himself to stay calm. He would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing him angry. The small indignities continued. Nathaniel watched as Logan served a meal to every row, except his. Passengers who had once ignored the situation began whispering, side-eyeing the interaction. A businessman, a few rows ahead, furrowed his brows, glancing between Logan and Nathaniel. A young woman in first class peeked back, her expression tight with discomfort. Nathaniel felt their stares. The tension in the cabin thickened, and yet no one spoke up. As the flight continued, Logan passed through the aisle again, this time stopping a few feet away from Nathaniel's row. He was chatting with another passenger, laughing, a little too loudly, as if performing for an audience. Then, Nathaniel heard it. "I swear, some people think they can just buy their way into places they don't belong." Muffled laughter. A few heads turning away awkwardly. Nathaniel froze. He knew that was meant for him. He had dealt with men like Logan before, the kind who hid their prejudice behind a polite uniform, behind fake smiles and small humiliations that could be excused as misunderstandings. But this was not a misunderstanding, and it was not going unnoticed. The businessman in first class finally lowered his laptop. The young woman in pearls stopped pretending to read her book. Even the flight attendants at the front of the cabin looked uneasy. Nathaniel inhaled deeply. That was it. He had given this man more chances than he deserved. It was time for Logan to learn exactly who he had been mistreating, and the moment of reckoning was about to arrive. Nathaniel sat still, his fingers steepled together as Logan strutted back toward first class, completely unaware that his fate had just been sealed. Nathaniel could have revealed the truth at any moment, could have ended this man's arrogance the second he was denied his seat. But he had waited. Let it build. Let the moment grow, because now, when the fall came, it would be absolute. Up front, the pilot scanned through the passenger list, his brow furrowing. He had been monitoring the flight's radio communications when something caught his eye. A name, Nathaniel Carter. Something about it seemed familiar. He quickly keyed in an inquiry to the airline's headquarters. Moments later, a response came through, and when he saw it, his stomach dropped. Nathaniel Carter was not just another passenger. He was the airline's majority owner. The pilot's pulse quickened. How had he not recognized the name? How had his own crew not known? He rose from his seat, adjusting his uniform, and turned to the co-pilot. "I need to handle something," he said, his voice tight. And then, with purpose, he stepped out of the cockpit and into the cabin. Passengers turned as the pilot strode down the aisle, his expression unreadable. Logan, still smirking near first class, barely noticed him at first. But when the pilot stopped in front of him, staring him down with an intensity that made the entire section go silent, his smug confidence wavered. The pilot's voice was firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for any mistreatment you have faced on this flight." Every head in the cabin snapped toward Nathaniel. Logan blinked, his throat bobbed. He turned, following the pilot's gaze, and then he saw the man he had spent the entire flight humiliating. Nathaniel Carter, the man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed, the man who owned everything around him. Logan's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Passengers began murmuring. A businessman whispered something to his seatmate. The young woman in pearls pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. Nathaniel finally rose from his seat. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened his blazer, stepping toward the front of the plane, where Logan stood frozen. Nathaniel looked at him, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something worse. Disappointment, the kind that makes a man's soul shrink. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but powerful enough to make the entire plane listen. "This is what happens when you judge a man by his skin instead of his character." Logan's lip trembled. His hands clenched at his sides, as if willing himself to wake up from this nightmare. But this was real. And it was only the beginning. The cabin was silent. Dead silent. Passengers who had spent the flight ignoring the situation were now hanging on to every word, every breath, as Nathaniel Carter stood face to face with the man who had humiliated him. Logan's posture had changed completely. Gone was the smug confidence, the thinly veiled arrogance. Now he looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff, with nowhere to go but down. Nathaniel did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to yell or berate, because the truth was enough, and the truth was this. Logan had insulted, mistreated, and publicly humiliated the owner of the very airline he worked for. The pilot, still standing beside them, cleared his throat. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. "Mr. Carter, I assure you that this will be handled immediately." Nathaniel did not even glance at him. His eyes remained locked on Logan. "No," he said. "I want to hear what he has to say." Logan's throat bobbed. The same mouth that had sneered, that had mocked, that had denied him service, now could not seem to form a single word. Finally his voice cracked out, barely above a whisper. "Sir, I didn't know." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Didn't know what?" Logan swallowed hard. I didn't know who you were." Nathaniel let that sit between them. The weight of the statement. Because that was the problem, wasn't it? It was not about what Logan knew. It was about what he assumed. About the way he looked at a black man in first class and immediately decided he did not belong. About the way he had spent the flight enjoying the power he thought he had, and now, that power was gone. Nathaniel turned to face the entire cabin. Passengers sat frozen, waiting for what would happen next. This was bigger than Logan now. This was about every person who had laughed, every person who had looked away, every person who had seen injustice unfolding and said nothing. Nathaniel spoke, his voice calm but unshakable. I built this airline to serve everyone with dignity. Clearly that message was lost on some. Logan flinched. Nathaniel turned back to the pilot. I expect a full report on this incident. The pilot nodded. Absolutely, sir. Nathaniel met Logan's eyes one last time. Enjoy the rest of your flight. And with that, he turned and walked back to first class, to the seat that had belonged to him all along. Nathaniel Carter lowered himself into his rightful first-class seat, finally stretching his legs in the space he had paid for, the seat that had been denied to him. The murmurs had not stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, rippling through the cabin like a shockwave. A businessman whispered urgently into his phone. A woman in pearls shook her head, as if she still could not process what had just happened. A young couple near the front watched Nathaniel with a newfound respect. But the loudest silence of all came from Logan. He stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides. He knew. His career was over. Nathaniel sipped the glass of champagne a flight attendant, a different one, visibly shaken, had hurriedly placed before him. The bubbly liquid was cool on his tongue, but it did not erase the heat of humiliation he had endured earlier. The pilot was already on his radio, speaking in hushed tones to the airline's headquarters. A decision was being made. Nathaniel did not need to wait for an answer. He already knew what it would be. A few minutes later, the flight intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice came through, calm but heavy with finality. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to apologize for the unprofessional conduct of a crew member on today's flight. Our airline does not tolerate discrimination in any form, and appropriate action will be taken upon landing. The words hung in the air. Everyone knew what they meant. Logan was finished. He stumbled back slightly, his face pale. He wanted to protest, to beg, to explain. But what could he say? There was no excuse for what he had done. Passengers speak up. Too little, too late now, and only now did people start speaking. I thought that was unfair, one man muttered, rubbing his chin. I almost said something. The young woman in pearls frowned. I knew something was wrong, but... She trailed off, guilt written all over her face. Nathaniel took another slow sip of his champagne. Now they spoke, now that it was safe, now that there was no risk to them. Where was this energy when he was being humiliated? Still, he did not call them out. They would carry their own shame. As the plane began its descent, Logan moved stiffly to the galley, standing near the exit. He did not look at Nathaniel again, but Nathaniel felt no triumph in the man's downfall. This was not about revenge. It was about something much greater. A warning, a lesson for every passenger on this plane, that the world is changing, that black men belong in first class, that people who abuse their power will eventually lose it, and most of all, that justice has a way of finding those who try to deny it. As Nathaniel stepped off the plane, he turned one last time, scanning the sea of faces. Some guilty, some humbled, some simply changed. And he left them with a thought that would stay with them long after the flight had landed. Have you ever been judged unfairly? What would you have done in this situation? Let's talk in the comments.